Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives 4 Symphony. And in this video, we're going to talk about the collapse section and the second movement. And it's a passage in which the orchestra divides into two groups, and one group accelerates on top of the other group and then collapses. This passage is well known and has been written about extensively, but there are some new things in it that have been unearthed in the new edition. And it's a great starting point for the entire series, I think. So let's jump right into it. So first, we're going to look at the full score using the notation that Ives provided, which doesn't really clarify how the passage is to be executed. To get the clarification, you need to read the gloss on this passage that Ives provided in a separate conductor's note. We'll get to that in a bit, but first, let's just focus on the original state of the notation. We're starting by looking at the measures that lead to the collapse section proper, focusing on the music and the strings, which are playing a treatment of In the Sweet By and By in 3/2, but with triplets set off by a quarter. This is exactly the kind of thing that Ives likes to do, shifting music so that it's out of step, right? But the larger point is that the strings are playing slowly and quietly. This continues on to the next page, but then, when you turn that page, winds, brass, pianos, and timpani enter, playing louder and faster moving material. Additionally, they're playing in 4/4 against the 3/2 of the strings, who haven't changed their meter at all. As you go through the pages of this section, it continues like this, with the winds, brass, pianos, and timpani playing faster looking music, with lots of quarters, eighths, and sixteenths, while the strings remain in 3/2, with halves and quarters dominating their rhythms. Finally, on the fourth page of this pandemonium, the instruction "fall away" appears above the top staff. At the same time, at the bottom, there's a note above the bass's final measure, above a tremolo cluster chord that they play, that says, "Basses start this with upper orchestra, not necessarily with lower orchestra unless they happen to be together." This note by Ives wasn't in the 1965 score. It's appearing in the new edition for the first time. We'll get to what it means in a bit, so for now, let's return to what the total orchestra is doing. When you flip to the next page, all the winds, brass, pianos, and timpani have vanished, and the material on the strings, that treatment of In the Sweet By and By in 3/2, is exposed again. It never had stopped. It continued unabated while the winds and brass were playing. So, what exactly happened in this passage? It looks like the winds, brass, pianos, and timpani enter in 4/4 time and play an even division of the 4/4 against the strings 3/2 throughout, right? Nope. Ives lacked a way to indicate with conventional notation what he intended, so he resorted to a written gloss on the passage to explain his intentions. And if, in the past, an interpreter did read that gloss, it was often misinterpreted. Let's take a look at it. The gloss is found in a collection of memos Ives made about the comedy movement, and he simply titled it Conductor's Note. It's the only thing interpreters of the score had in the past as a reference to Ives's intentions. Ives's writing in it is a thicket at times, and you often have to read his sentences 3 times over before they sink in and make sense. Let's look at what he said about the passage in question. He wrote, "The instruments are divided here into 2 separate orchestras, the lower continuing the preceding adagio, while the upper, including woodwind, brass, timpani, and both pianos, breaks suddenly in, canceling the sounds of the lower orchestra, unless its players can be placed near enough to the majority of listeners, or the upper orchestra removed sufficiently so that it may, in a way, be heard through the lower. Both groups may keep in the time relation indicated on this page, but at the beginning of the next page, the upper orchestra begins to play faster and faster until the collapse indicated, but which will occur sooner, perhaps toward the end of the previous page. Care must be taken that the lower orchestra in no way increases its tempo or intensity through here. After the upper orchestra has stopped, the lower must sound quietly on, as if it had been oblivious of the disturbance. During this passage, it may be advisable to have one of the players of the upper orchestra act as a separate conductor." So, here Ives is explaining that the total orchestra is split. The strings and percussion constitute a lower orchestra playing in 3/2, while the winds, brass, timpani, and pianos constitute an upper orchestra playing in 4/4. Ives then explains that starting on the second page of the split passage, the upper orchestra accelerates its tempo until it collapses, and then the lower orchestra finishes the passage a bit later, following the tempo that it's maintained all along. Many fine conductors of the old 1965 score did read this passage and did attempt to realize it, but few of them noticed that the acceleration of the upper orchestra is to begin on the second page of the split passage. Either they began the acceleration on the first page of the split, or worse, they applied no acceleration whatsoever. This is understandable, however, because Ives's writing is dense, and nothing in the full score of this passage makes this clear. So, this means that for the first page of the split, the meters of the two groups are evenly divided. It's an exact 4-4 against 3-2, with measure equals measure between the groups. But then, on the second page of the split, the 4-4 group begins to accelerate. When the 4-4 group collapses, the 3-2 group continues on, wherever it happens to be in relation to the 4-4 group, and then the two groups realign seamlessly at the beginning of the next page, without any pause. Ives's commentary is preserved in this edition, but the performance score itself needed to convey this information notationally. There needed to be a way of clarifying for the conductor when the two groups are playing an even division of 3-2 against 4-4, and when the upper group is no longer aligned with the lower group, but is accelerating on top of it. So here's how it's solved. Now we're looking at the performance score. Before we were looking at the engraving of Ives's original notation and the critical edition. Here, during the measures leading up to the split, it looks pretty much the same. About the only exception is that the notation in the strings has been revised slightly so that the beat locations of the offset triplets are clear. But then, after the soft introductory passage, when you then turn the page and get to the split, presto! The score is divided into a very clear graphical separation of the two groups. Here's the upper orchestra, and below it is the lower orchestra. It's extremely helpful to separate the groups and put their instruments in score order within each bracketed division. That way, the conductor of each section can easily see which instruments belong to it. Incidentally, the instruments in the upper orchestra here are pretty much the same as what you'd find on the top of a standard score order page, and the same could be said of the instruments in the lower orchestra. So bracketing the instruments like this may not seem like a giant leap forward in the score's notation. But in other places in the symphony, there are hodgepodge collections of instruments that form different groups, each in its own meter, and for those passages, it's clearest to bracket them separately, just as is done here, and in standard score order within each bracketing. That way, the conductor of each metered group can see which players belong to that group, and the groups may then be rehearsed independently before being brought together en masse. But back to the collapse section. Here, on the first page of the split, there's an even division of the upper orchestra's 4-4 against the lower orchestra's 3-2, with the measure lengths equal and all rhythms spaced appropriately. But then, when you look at the next page, you'll see 1, 2, 3 measures in the upper orchestra against 2 measures in the lower orchestra. This is where the upper orchestra is to begin its acceleration, so it's where the two groups split from each other temporally. The desynchronization of the measures is a visual alert that something special is going on here, and the tempo at the top further clarifies the intent. The upper orchestra accelerates while the lower orchestra maintains its previous tempo. So, looking on the next page, you'll see the same thing. There are 3 measures in the upper orchestra against 2 below, with no syncing of internal rhythms, as there would be if it were an exact 3 against 2, which it's not. Finally, on the next page, the notation drives it home. The upper orchestra has finished before the lower orchestra, with a huge gap of white space following it. Any conductor looking at the notation and reading Ives's note will understand the intended execution of the passage. This is an example of one of the goals I had for the edition. Wherever possible, let the notation communicate the intent. But what about the note above the tremoloed chord in the basses? Remember, it states, basses start this with upper orchestra, not necessarily with lower orchestra, unless they happen to be together. It may now be obvious what Ives's intention is. When the upper orchestra collapses, the basses leap ahead to the tremoloed chord and hold it until the rest of the strings catch up with them. The effect is that of the upper orchestra collapsing to the tremoloed chord, like this. So, the bass parts explain this, but there's now a cue in the full score as well that reads, on downbeat of measure 51 of the upper orchestra, immediately cue the contrabasses and the lower orchestra to jump ahead to their measure 51, sustaining their tremolo until the downbeat of the next section. Between the instruction and the bass parts and the cue in the full score, this wonderful effect is now unlikely to be overlooked. Following this, the two orchestras seamlessly resynchronize on the next page, as you can see here. The split orchestra notation with brackets is gone, and standard score notation has resumed. But let's look back to the previous page, the last page of the split. Notice the text here that reads, "no pause." I added that because I know at least one conductor who misinterpreted a feature of the old 1965 score, which had a single hand-drawn fermata on the final bar line of the solo piano part. That fermata was added by the editors of the 1965 score, who apparently were trying to show that the solo piano pauses along with the other instruments who belong to the upper orchestra. Those instruments all have fermatas on the rests that follow the last music they play. The solo piano, however, has no rest following its music. So where do you put the fermata? Over its final bar line, right? That's what the 1965 editors did. But this caused confusion for at least one conductor I know. He thought that these fermatas applied to the entire orchestra, not just to the upper orchestra. So he brought all the players in both orchestras to a pause at that bar line, effectively stopping the Celestial Railroad in its tracks, which is clearly not Ives' intent. This misinterpretation needed to be prevented from happening again in the new edition. Moving the fermatas to the final bar line of each instrument in the upper orchestra is actually a good idea, because that's where the pause occurs. Combining that with a visible gap following the measure clarifies the meaning, and adding no pause in lower orchestra drives it home. This all ensures that the music will continue unabated, and the total effect should be clear. There are now a lot of good recordings of the new edition showcasing this passage. Let's close by listening to one of them with the score.